What day is today?
Today is the 4th of June. And you say, and what happened on the 4th of June?
And what happened on the 4th of June, Steve?
And I say, on this day in 1841, William Newton Monroe was born in Indiana.
And who is he?
Well, he started out as a school teacher. And then he became a soldier on the Union side of the Civil War. Then he became a railroad builder. And that brought him to Southern California. And then he became a land promoter and visionary for a new community. And then ultimately he became known as the father of Monrovia, even though he had help. He died in 1935 in December. He almost made it to the 50th anniversary of Monrovia's founding. He only missed it by a couple of months. He's commemorated by a stone in Library Park, the southeast corner, that was placed in 1930, well, 30s, after his death, probably 36, 37. And there are two boxes, two time capsules at the base of it. One placed, well, it wasn't placed when they said it was. They put the plaque down, and then several years later they discovered the contents was still on a shelf in the Chamber of Commerce. So they finally appropriately placed it. And the second capsule was placed at the time of the Monrovia Centennial.
So talk about his family.
Well,
His immediate family.
he was
and
one
his...
of a large family. I think there were 7 Monroe children. One of them died, well, 2 of them, well, one, Lucy, I think her name was, died quite young. His brother Daniel died in the Civil War, probably from disease rather than from battle. There were 6, I think there were 6 brothers. I think I'm going to have to bump up the count. There might have been 8 children. Anyway, aside from Daniel, who died as a young man, and Lucy, who died in childhood, all the rest of them lived to maturity and lived fairly lengthy lives. In addition to William, there was, Felix, Campbell, and then there was George W., probably George Washington. George Washington came out to Monrovia during the land boom, but returned to Iowa, and his descendants are there. His daughter, Monroe's younger sister, Eliza Lee, also came and spent most of the rest of her life here as well. There is a Monroe family plot. I should say plots because there's several contiguous plots in Live Oak Cemetery where there are a whole lot of Monroes buried.
And Felix?
Felix built a house on North Magnolia and spent the rest of his life here. Campbell lived in the house later that the Monroes built as their first cottage. He added on to it. Lived in that till 1918 when he moved with his unmarried wife and unmarried daughters to Long Beach. He had health issues, and they thought that living at the beach side would be better for his health. George, as I say, spent the rest of his life in Iowa and had their descendants. There were notes that Myron took where descendants of George came to visit him, and they talked about the Monroe family.
What about his wife and children?
Okay. His wife was born Mary Jane Hall. She was a school teacher. She went to Fort Kearny, Nebraska to teach. That's where they met, and that's where they were married. They had 5 children, one of whom died young, Jessie Lee. The others were Milton Sanders Monroe, George Otto Monroe. I mentioned Jessie Lee. Pardon me. Myrtle Mignonette Monroe and Maybelle Huntington Monroe, named after Huntingtons of Big 4 fame. The daughters, well, George and Myrtle and Mabel all lived, I think, into their 80s, early or mid-80s. Milton was killed in 1899 in a railroad accident in Pomona. Eastbound Southern Pacific was on its way to Pomona, near Claremont. It was rounding a bend Witnesses said it seemed to be going at an excessive rate of speed. Anyway, a wheel on the engine broke. The engine derailed. He was injured severely and died later from his injuries. I have a friend in Claremont who said that the first hospital in Claremont was inspired by the fact that at the time of that accident there was no hospital in Claremont, and those injured had to be taken to Pomona in any available conveyance. But that accident, the lack of a hospital, inspired the founding of a hospital in Claremont, according to her. So he was the first, no, not the first. The Monroe grandparents, Sanders and Catherine, were the first ones to be buried at Live Oak, and then Milton was the first of his immediate family to be buried at Live Oak. George married twice. Milton married twice. Both sons divorced. Oh, shame! Good Baptist family, and both of their sons divorced their wives, or vice versa.
Why?
Who knows? I haven't checked the record to find out if it was mental cruelty, desertion, or incompatibility. Anyway, Milton's first wife was Mary Nevada Thomas, the daughter of a business associate in Los Angeles, John Thomas, and his wife. His second wife was Christine Mathewson. Her family came to Monrovia 1880s, probably 87 or so. They were Scottish. They went to New Zealand first, and then they came to Southern California from New Zealand. That's where Milton and Chrissy met, were married. George Otto's first wife was Lizzie, or Elizabeth Miller, who was the daughter of another prominent Monrovia family. After their divorce, he married Annetta. Give me a minute. This reminds me of my grandmother. We'd ask her a story or ask her a question, she'd say, just give me a minute. Annetta Evans, who had not been married before and snagged George Otto, and they were happily married for many years. Myrtle Mignonette Monroe married Bruce Bailey, and they had no children. And Maybelle Huntington Monroe married Bruce Dyer, and they had a son.
Now, is there anything special we should hear about Myrtle?
Well, you know, we all have our legacies. And Myrtle's is Myrtle Avenue in Monrovia because it was named for her. Colonel Kiefer's daughter, Charlotte, almost had a legacy. She did for a little while. She was the daughter of Colonel Samuel Kiefer, who was another associate of William Monroe's, who came at the time of Monrovia's founding and was very active in real estate. He built the Grandview Hotel and a business block on Monroe Avenue. So when the town of Monrovia was laid out in 1886 in honor of Colonel Kiefer's daughter Charlotte, what we now know as Canyon Boulevard was named Charlotte Avenue. And it was Charlotte for about 20 or so years.
Now, why didn't any of the other Monroe children get a street named after them?
They didn't have Myrtle's persuasive powers. She probably had her old man wrapped around her little finger. Anyway.
And do you know anything about her middle name,
I have no idea. Somebody must have been reading fancy books or listening to fancy operas. Mignonette.
And tell us about Huntington. You said that was one of the kids' second names.
Okay. After the Civil War was over, William Monroe went into business with his father-in-law, Milton Hall, building railroads in the Midwest. They might have even been involved in building the portion of the Transcontinental Railroad that went west from Omaha, Nebraska to Promontory Point in Utah. Maybe not the whole thing, but part of that overall process of building west to link the country together via Transcontinental Railroad. And in the process of doing that, he got to know Collis P. Huntington, who was one of the big four responsible for building the Central Pacific eastward. to join with the whatever it was, Union Pacific, perhaps it was building westward. Anyway, he got to know Collis Huntington, who was the reason that Monroe was located to Los Angeles. Huntington wanted Monroe to come to California, build railroads for him here, and so I'm assuming that's where the Huntington came from, Collis P. Huntington.
And so, speaking of building railroads and moving around, talk to us about Mary Jane and what her job was as they did this.
She was very resourceful. She actually, when Monroe came in 1875 to Los Angeles, he built or bought a hotel. Either bought or managed. Anyway, the Thompson and West 1880 History of Los Angeles County has an old steel cut print of the Pacific Hotel, which was adjacent to the railroad depot in Los Angeles. And it mentions Monroe as the proprietor. I'm assuming he was also the owner. And Mary Jane would manage the hotel in his absence. So she was quite a capable businesswoman. She also was very adaptive. When they came to Monrovia, they did not have a place to stay. No house, sagebrush, boulders, etc. So they set up camp near the corner of what is now Hillcrest and Magnolia under oak trees. And they lived out in the open under it. Well, they had a tent.
With their children?
With 4 children. So she probably cooked on a wood-burning stove out in the open. They slept in her tent. She did her laundry, probably using that wood-burning stove to boil water, etc. So she was a pioneer woman in the sense that the lack of the common amenities did not stop her. She functioned nonetheless. And when Monroe was building railroads in Texas, he fitted up a boxcar so his family could live in it. So she lived in a boxcar for a couple of years, keeping house while her husband built the railroads. As the railroad was built further along, they just rolled the boxcar along so Monroe could have the comforts of home right adjacent to his work site.
And then after they camped in Monrovia, and she did that, then what was her job as they built their houses?
She served as hostess to the countryside. But seriously, she was well known for her hospitality, and people who were traveling east would frequently stop at the Oaks, their Monrovia home, where they would be entertained very cordially by Mary Jane. The house was large, had a broad central hallway. The rooms adjacent to that central hallway had large pocket doors that could all be opened up into one space. So she was quite the entertainer, known for her hospitality.
And then they lived in that house for how long, and then what happened?
They lived in the house.
It was
Oaks.
Built in when?
It was completed in 1885, so they lived in it for about 3 years. And then Monroe took on a railroad contract in Chile. So the house was sold to E.F. Spence.
Did she go to Chile?
She went initially to Chile, and then I think there was some political unrest, and they came back. Maybe not necessarily to Monrovia, but I don't think they stayed long term. So the house then was property of E.F. Spence, who was interested in the cause of education for young women. And since Los Angeles was so different, was so far, quote, far away, unquote, he decided that there should be a branch of the University of Southern California in Monrovia. So was it the Monrovia Young Ladies Seminary? Anyway, it was a branch of Southern California. They built a second building next to the Oaks for additional class space and probably maybe dormitory rooms. And it operated for about 18 months. It was not a financial success. The economic depression after the crash of the land boom was a huge factor, and so it was closed down. But it functioned as a young women's college for a while. E.F. Spence was one of the founders of USC in 1880. So that was why he saw it as a branch of USC.
So Monroe built Monrovia with some partners. You want to talk about those
Sure.
partners?
Well, Three of the partners he got to know probably through his contacts in Los Angeles, maybe two of them. So E.F. Spence, interesting history, born in Ireland, came to the United States, to Ohio first, came across, probably, I don't know if he came across the plains or he came via the Isthmus of Panama. Anyway, he tried mining for a while in Nevada County, almost killed himself in the mines, undermined his health, no pun intended. And he decided there's got to be a better way to make a living, so he went into Nevada City and opened a pharmacy. And from there he went to San Jose. His first wife died in Nevada City and is buried in the old cemetery there. In 1869 or thereabouts, he went back to Ireland. He married a cousin, Anna Maria Spence, and they came to San Jose, back to San Jose from Ireland. Spent some time in San Diego and then came to Los Angeles, became involved in banking, and by the time Monroe knew him, he was the president of the First National Bank of Los Angeles. Then there was question.
Yeah. So he was a miner, then a pharmacist, then what was the third thing?
Then a banker.
And then a banker.
Right.
So these are interesting times when you could.
Right. Now the reason I found out about the Nevada County, first found out about my grandmother's family's ranch in Nevada County was near a small community called Spenceville. Now Myron gave me a book called California Place Names. It gave the historical origin of the names of places in California. And I thought, So I checked it out. It's Spenceville, named for E.F. Spence of Nevada City, who gave the lumber to build the Spenceville schoolhouse. So they built a schoolhouse, so they named the community after him in his honor. I found out about Nevada City later, but that was my introduction to E.F. Spence in California.
And so he built a big house. Where and what happened to it?
They had a house on Bunker Hill in Los Angeles. I don't know much about it.
I mean the one here.
Well, yeah, and then they built, when Monrovia started, they had large property here. They had a nice large lot on Prospect Avenue, the north side. At that time, that area of Monrovia was known as Silver Hill. There was a naming scheme where they were going to name places after various gems and precious metals. So Gold Hill was what we now know as, well, let's see, what do we call it? North Alta Vista, basically. And there was a Diamond Flats, there was a Ruby Canyon, there was a Gold Hill, a Silver Hill. Anyway, Silver Hill was Prospect Avenue at the highest point of it. Spence had a large house there, and the Newsom brothers of San Francisco opened an architectural office in Los Angeles during the land boom. So the Spences went to that architectural firm to have them design their Monrovia home for them. They had a name for it, Laurel Bray. Laurel Bray? Laurel Bray. That's what they liked. So the Spences owned that probably until maybe the early 1900s and sold it ultimately and went to live at the Oaks. As I say, E.F. Spence bought the Oaks. Later on, after his death, Anna Spence probably gave up the property in Los Angeles, lived full-time at the Oaks, and then about 1907 or so, she sold it, moved to a small place on South Primrose where she spent the rest of her life.
So what happened to the big house that they built on Prospect?
Went through several changes of ownership. I'm trying to think of the name. Anyway, in 1920, the property, still a large lot, was acquired by two doctors, Dr. Kalb and Dr. Kirshner. And they tore down the original house and on the same foundation built a two-family house, two separate wings with some shared space, and that's the house that's there now.
Okay, so you were talking about Spence and then some of his other
Well, okay.
Monroe's other partners, Bicknell, Crank.
John D. Bicknell was a lawyer with a firm, prestigious law firm in Los Angeles that morphed over time and through partnership changes into Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, ancient Los Angeles law firm. So my sister, this is an aside, my sister decided to go back to law school at UCLA. And her class decided they were going to do a musical, which is a spoof on law school. And they chose their theme, the show South Pacific. They rewrote some of the songs with lyrics that matched. One was they rewrote Valley High to Gibson Dunn. Gibson Dunn will call you, da da da. Anyway, Gibson Dunn will call you. I guess if you graduate #1 in your class and your other academic credentials are impeccable, Gibson Dunn will tap you on the shoulder and say, "We want you for our firm." Anyway, and then there's a couple others I don't remember, but it was, my sister had a hand in writing it, and it was hilarious. But I'll never forget, Gibson Dunn will call you to the tune of Valley High. So anyway, back to John D. Bicknell. They say prominent Los Angeles attorney, and hence known to Monroe because Monroe served on the LA City Council and was a mover and shaker. The other partner was James F. Crank, who was instrumental as a moving force behind the Los Angeles and San Gabriel Valley Railroad. There was no easy way to get from Pasadena to Los Angeles. So Crank had the bright idea of building a railroad from Los Angeles out to Pasadena. So I think it started in 1883, reached Pasadena probably about 1885, roughly. And then the idea was, well, we've built it this far, why don't we continue east? And I think it was about that time that Monroe thought, if the railroad's heading east, it's heading towards land I've already built, this is going to make a significant difference in the land use. Rather than a fruit farm, maybe it needs to be a new community. Because if the railroad's being built, that'll provide a way to get there. It'll provide a convenient way for people to go back and forth. Anyway, it will change the country by having a road.
So are you saying that his original idea behind settling here might not have been developing a community?
He wrote in his autobiography that he and Mary Jane's initial objective was to simply to establish a fruit farm in the country. Sort of gentleman, gentle lady occupation. And it was only later, I think, when he saw the potential that would develop when the railroad was completed to the east, that he began to think of a community instead. So Monroe knew those three, and then the other individual was Jerry Felvey, who was the foreman of Lucky Baldwin's ranch. He owned 30 acres surrounded by, very close to the property that Monroe already owned, and adjacent to property that was bought by Bicknell, Spence, and Crank. So he was part of the group that pooled their individual holdings into what they called the Monrovia Land and Water Company. And that's the organization that put Monrovia on the map and began the sale of lots May 17, 1886.
So there was a town site.
There were two things. There was the Monrovia Tract, which was like the Santa Anita Tract, a larger piece of land. made up of lots of Rancho Santa Anita that were bought from Baldwin. Then there were in the center, almost in the center, was a town site, which was 20 blocks of 50 by 160 foot lots. And surrounded by the larger tract that had mostly 5-acre parcels. So yesterday I thought, the newspaper said that the Monrovia Land and Water Company bought 3,000 acres. I thought, that seems a little high. So I sat down with the first map of Monrovia, the tract itself, and I calculated the acreage. It was not 3,000 acres. It was closer to, it was like 600. So hyperbole in the press is not new.
This was an old newspaper you were looking at.
It was from the excerpts that Myron laboriously transcribed and you laboriously scanned and made available to search. So I did a search on Monrovia Land and Water Company. It brought up this information, and that was the article in the newspaper, local newspaper, that said it's 3,000 acres. So either it was a typo, or the editor was playing fast and loose with the truth.
So there were these smaller lots. So tell us about the lots and what the bigger lots were for, and then the surrounding
the bigger lots,
property and who bought it.
The smaller lots, or the town site lots, were basically 8,000 square feet, 50 by 160. Almost uniformly, 50 by 160. Around that, the other lots in the Monrovia tract were almost all 5 acres. Some a little more, some a little less, depending on the adjustments that had to be made for streets or rancho boundary.
And why were they bigger? What were they for?
For somebody who wanted an orange grove. 10 acres, usually 10 acres or 20 was kind of the standard size for an orange grove. That would generate enough revenue to support a family. And I'm pretty sure their idea was, we're going to put these 5-acre parcels on the map for somebody who wants to do what Monroe did, get out to the country and get involved in agriculture. Let me see, you asked me about the 5 acres, and I said that originally they thought it would attract people who wanted to perhaps have an orange grove, and the town site was so they could live in town, quote unquote, in town, and be very adjacent to their property. What ended up happening when the boom started, or really took hold, almost all of those 5-acre parcels were further subdivided. You look at the original map of 1883, 1886, and then you look at 1887, and really significant number of those 5-acre parcels have been subdivided.
So they were used for residences instead of orange groves?
Sure. They ended up becoming town lots instead of...
But there were still a lot of orange groves.
In the northern part of Monrovia. But I was talking just specifically about the Monrovia tract.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because the original tract did not extend, well, it extended up to what's now Foothill.
So what were the boundaries again?
Of the original tract? It was... It was Mayflower on the west. I'm trying to visualize. Foothill on the north for sure. What we now know as probably, was it Shamrock? Well, let's say roughly Shamrock to the east and Wardy Road to the south. I'll need to look at the map again and say, okay, that's what it was then, and now that is what street. But it was, I say, about 600 acres. And by the late 1887, most of it had been subdivided into town lots.
So when the first land sale happened,
Yes.
then that's what we celebrate as Monrovia's birthday.
Right.
So what was that all about, and where
Well, I'm not sure why they picked the 17th of May. guess they were ready. But they advertised, and the lots went on the market. A lot of them were sold. Some were sold outright. Some were sold on a contract basis.
What does that mean?
You put so much down, and then you paid on a sales contract. So much down, so much, let's say 3 months, 6 months, and a year. And then you got your deed. I was puzzled because my house, let me say, the title to my house wasn't issued until 1888. Or I should say the deed wasn't issued. And yet I think the house is older. Then I found Myron's list where he had enumerated, or he cited the newspaper article that enumerated all the houses built in 1887, and my house was one of them. And I thought, well, why is it showing up in 1887, but the first deed is 1888? And then I got a call from my friend Howard, who said, he bought from a family that owned the house for like 90-some years. The Booth, ultimately it was the Booth family. It started out as the Ewell, UHL. Anyway, Howard called me and said, Doreen Booth just brought me a whole bunch of old documents. I think you'd be interested. Come on over and take a look. So we did. I don't know if we found it that time, but anyway, Howard found a map of the Pacific View Tract, which is where my house was originally and where his house was still. It showed the tract, the streets, the lots, the lot numbers, and so forth. On the bottom, it had terms of sale, and that said so much down, so much, I can't quote it exactly. But then the light dawned. For my house, the original builder didn't get the deed until he paid off the sales contract. So yes, it was built in 1887, but he was still paying on the sales contract for the land, and didn't get the title until he paid it off. Then he could turn around and sell it. So that contract was later cited as a real problem because after the land boom collapsed on itself, and they started, and Monrovia was incorporated, they needed to levy property taxes. In a lot of cases, they didn't know who owned the property. So they had to make a rule of thumb. I think they said if one payment only was made on the sales contract, they considered that title remained with the seller. And if at least two payments had been made, then title went to the purchaser. And you've seen the 1888 assessment book, and you've seen the huge section of unknown owners. What was why? Most of those lots, I think, were sold on sales contract, and they didn't know the status of the property.
So they sold the first lots.
Right. Well, yeah, they were, but I don't know if the first ones were on a sales contract, but many of them were on a sales contract. So you didn't have to pay down, only had to put money down and start paying on the sales contract.
But so talk a little bit about sort of big picture about, there was the first land sale and lots were sold, and then there was another tract that rolled out and another, and what was sort of the order of how things happened?
Okay, well, for example,
because there was nothing here in 1884.
Yeah,
there were fewer than 10 houses here.
Nothing, probably. The Monroe house, the cottage, is probably the only. There were, to the east were houses in Duarte.
Wasn't there somebody in the canyon with a beekeeper?
Well, 84 was. I don't know if Bell was up there in 84 or not. The Rankins had been there, but they'd left. Bell had been in Cloverleaf Canyon, but I think he'd moved to Duarte by 1884.
So 84 was the cottage that
right.
William and Mary J. Monroe first built.
But as far as anything else around?
And that was on Monroe Place.
On Monroe Place.
And then 85 they built the Oaks on Primrose.
Right.
And 86 John Anderson
came out to build the Mills Hotel, the Mills Hotel.
and built the Anderson house on Ivy,
Right.
215 East Ivy.
How about 215 East Lime?
I mean Lime. Yeah, that
Okay.
would be that. That's good. Okay.
Now, I've never researched all the deeds. I only looked at I wanted to, I'd seen several references to the location of the first lot that was sold. So I went into the old Hall of Records in LA when it was still there as opposed to Norwalk and looked up the deed and found the deed to Catherine Wilson. And it described the lot by block and lot number. So I could verify independently that it was in fact the southeast corner of Lemon and Myrtle that Catherine bought when she bought.
That was the first lot bought in the town.
Right.
Town.
Town. Not the tract.
Where the
Town.
shoe store is now.
Where the shoe store is now. And then I think the second sale was to William Mills, who then built the hotel. Well, John Anderson built it, but William Mills had it built south of the lot Catherine purchased.
And hers was 2 lots, right?
Just one.
Oh,
I think Mills bought 2 lots. Catherine bought one right on the corner, and I believe Mills bought the 2 lots south of hers on the east side of the street.
and that's where the Mills Hotel was, right there. Okay.
Right there.
So then, when the lot across the street, north, on the west side of at Lemon, the Kiefer building, when was that? That was 1887 that was built.
1886.
86, okay.
Right.
Was built in 86,
Built in 86.
and it's still there.
Yep. Looking very much like it did when built, with the exception of the additions.
So that's one of the 10 oldest buildings in town.
It is. It's actually the oldest
Commercial building.
commercial building. Then we have the Duarte Schoolhouse, but anyway.
Okay, so there was that land sale.
Right. I'm trying to think of the order. There was property to the east that was added in 1886. By east, I mean east of the original Monrovia tract, like in the southeastern part of what's now Monrovia. Some of the dates on the deed maps, I think, are 86. Pam Barkus did a lot of work getting images of the original tract maps. I think some of that happened in 86. Monroe and his brother owned north of Foothill and west of Myrtle. That, I think, was done, added in 87.
That's called the Monroe Edition.
Monrovia, yeah, Monrovia, I think the proper name is the Monroe Addition to the Monrovia Tract. And then east of there, east of Myrtle, were several ownerships of the Kiefer. Bought lot 69 of Rancho Santa Anita and subdivided that, and that's basically Foothill to Greystone and Myrtle to Ivy, I think. And then later on, the Kiefer's son, if he didn't develop the first one, the second development was definitely his, and that was the Ocean View, which went from Greystone north to Hillcrest, and as far over as Canyon. But there was also addition number 1 to the Monrovia tract, and that was that huge area where Spence had his lot on Prospect. Should have brought the maps so we could look at them.
I have it. I can get it. And there was the Campbell, Sartori, and Myers.
They bought I think they bought from Louis Bradbury, because that property was immediately, the tract was immediately east of the Pacific View was immediately east of the Monrovia tract.
So, not all of what we consider Monrovia was part of what Lucky Baldwin sold to.
But Baldwin basically sold well, if you consider Fifth Avenue, Baldwin originally owned everything east of Santa Anita Avenue in Arcadia,
How far east?
to the Rancho boundary line between Rancho Santa Anita and Rancho Azusa de Duarte.
And what, that's Norumbega?
That's Norumbega. Originally known as East Avenue, but now known as Norumbega. And of that, the portion east of Fifth Avenue was ultimately acquired and became part of Monrovia.
Okay, so you said the Pacific View tract was acquired from Bradbury?
I believe so. I think the three of them bought directly from Bradbury and then subdivided it.
So Bradbury had gotten it from Lucky Baldwin?
He got it from Alexander Weil, who was a entrepreneur in San Francisco who bought it from, I think he bought it from, okay, let's go back first. Andres Duarte lost it at the sheriff's foreclosure sale. And it went through several owners, and then Alexander Weil bought it, I think in 1868, and had it subdivided in 1872. It went on the market in 72. Parcels began to sell in 73, which is when Duarte started to be settled, and the Duarte School District was established. And then in 1883, Wild sold about the western 1/3 to Bradbury, and that went all the way up to the boundary line between the two ranchos. So when the Monrovia tract was being created, the Monrovia Land and Water Company bought some acreage from Bradbury so they could square it off. They bought east of the diagonal boundary line so that the tract was squared off. I'm trying to think, there's one. Wish I could visualize it, but anyway, they did buy from. So the first sale.
Do you want me to get the map?
Yeah, that'd be great. First sale was to. I should say the first Bradbury sale was to the Monrovia Land and Water Company, and the second, as far as I know, was to the three of them who did the Pacific View tract.
I'll go get the map.
Okay.